Okay, today I will be talking about what it means to look at paintings as historical documents, or more properly, what paintings can tell us might be able to tell us about Kyrgyz and Central Asian history, and what we can and cannot know about the past through visual representations of it. I'll be focusing on the paintings of Vasily Vereshchagin. He was a Russian painter in the late 19th century who created an iconic set of ethnic portraits known as the Turkestan series, which he produced from 1868 to 1874 as artist in residence of the imperial administration in Tashkent. This was the administrative center of Imperial Turkestan, an area of government set up by the Russian authorities, which encompassed parts of the Kazakh steppe and what we would now call simply Central Asia. At first glance, and you will see a series of Vereshchagin's ethnic portraits as I'm talking, his art seems almost photographic in its attention to detail and in its representation of the most intricate minutiae. There is a high degree of realism as well as a consistent devotion to accuracy. That is to say, the paintings appear as if they are works of art that were able to mirror things as they were in reality. This realism is evident in almost all of his paintings, which are filled with intricately rendered wood engravings, tapestries, fabrics, and other ethnographic detail. All of this is sort of just piled up in front of the spectator in Vereshchagin's paintings. This attention to detail would seem to make these very reliable ethnographic documents. This is how they were described in this manner at the time, and commentators frequently referred to Vereshchagin as an ethnographic painter. In other words, they appear to provide a very accurate visual record of ethnic and historical realities in Central Asia and of the varied ethnic groups whose aspects, modes of dress, and characteristics they capture. They are works of art that are so seemingly real that it is hard sometimes to distinguish them from photographs. This attention to detail, however, masks as much as it reveals, in the sense that this manifest realism also obscures the fact that these are artistic representations that do not simply reflect reality, but that also shape, distort, and frame it, and that shows very little or very few traces of what is fundamentally going on here. What we have in all of these paintings is a Russian artist commissioned by imperial authorities, sifting and sorting through the very complex ethnic landscape of 19th century Central Asia and deciding what is and what is not worthy of ethnic representation. Vereshchagin did not simply represent things faithfully as they were, but he picked and chose from the teeming ethnic diversity of this region, and then reduced all of this complexity to the two-dimensional confines of a painter's canvas. All of the ethnographic minutiae in his Turkestan series, all of its rich and ornate visual depictions obscures this, as does Vereshchagin's consistent effort to efface all traces of his artistic reworking of objects and peoples. There are few errant brushstrokes or other visual imperfections in his painting that would indicate that these are anything other than photorealistic representations of Central Asian ethnicities, pasts, and traditions. So Vereshchagin's art was a product of a particular historical moment. It developed in tandem with the Russian conquest of the region, and with an accompanying body of ethnographic knowledge concerned with what the scholar Madeline Reeves terms establishing broad indicative types, or typology, representative of one or other cultural category. The Russian administrators and military officials who ruled Central Asia after the Russian conquest of the region were overwhelmed by the ethnic diversity here, by the seemingly endless range of peoples that made up Central Asia at this time. They chose to manage this complexity by classifying it and trying to put it all in some kind of ethnic order. They tried to reduce its lived complexities to a series of more clearly defined ethnic categories and types, ethnic markers that would allow them to sift through the diverse population of Central Asia and to conclusively identify peoples and groups as Kazakh, Uzbek, Sart, Kyrgyz, etc. Edward Said describes something similar in his text Orientalism, his study of the way Western knowledge and science represented and described the East. He claims that there was a tendency in this knowledge to make out of every observable detail a generalization, and out of every generalization an immutable law about the Oriental nature, type, custom, or mentality. That is, they would take a custom, tradition, or characteristic at random and apply it in a way that was meant to sum up entire geographies and people. The Russians who ruled Central Asia in this century did something very much like this. It's important to remember that Russian rule in the region involved the expansive effort of one culture to collect and categorize dozens of others. The Russian military mission to the region was accompanied by a small army of botanists, ethnographers, and statisticians who worked in tandem with colonial authorities to amass and organize the region's complexities. Vereshchagin's art was very much a part of this process. He did not simply represent things as he saw them, but he worked or molded the ethnic complexities of this region so that they fit the classifications and categories the Russians were attempting to create in order to manage the population of Central Asia. Vereshchagin's art was an art of ethnic essences. He formulated ethnic types. His art consists of a series of portraits in which individuals are made to stand for an entire ethnicity, and they unveiled this practice with the multiplication of intricately illustrated engravings, carpets, doors, objects, tapestries, etc. It made the objects and peoples it rendered seem as if they were photorealistic ethnographic documents. All of the details in Vereshchagin's paintings then made what was in essence an exercise in art and power seem like it was something entirely different, like it was a simple representation of reality. It made it seem as if it was simply knowledge. Vereshchagin had been trained by Jean-Léon Gérôme, a French Orientalist painter who had perfected this practice of clothing art with numberless facts. One scholar has asserted that the seeming documentary realism of Gérôme's paintings, much like that of Vereshchagin's, obscured his making of the Orient, his artistic reworking of it with excessive gratuitous details. Part of the strategy of an Orientalist painter is to make his viewers forget that there was any bringing into being at all, to convince them that works like these were simply reflections, scientific in their exactitude, of an existing Oriental reality. What I mean to convey here with all of this is that when we look at Vereshchagin's paintings, we need to look beyond the detail and realize that this art does not simply reflect reality. It shapes and distorts it with the tools of an aesthetic tradition that made art wear the mask of ethnographic knowledge. The photographic realities we encounter in Vereshchagin's paintings were not found, but made by the Russian painter and tied up in lots of ways with the Russian conquest of the region.